So, and some of this is going to review a little bit of what we talked about, or what you read about in chapter 2, because we didn't actually spend a lot of time talking about variables and hypotheses and those kinds of things, but it was covered in the chapter. So it's going to kind of pick up some of that information and then really focus on, what we do specifically in the research process. So we're going to, kind of dig into some of this is just going to be vocabulary, and in this part of the chapter you really will need to memorize these terms and be able to use them and figure out, is this an example of an indicator or a variable or a concept, and what's the difference between those kinds of things. So you'll see that in the quiz, and you'll see that again in the midterm when we cover this topic. And then I'm going to walk you through some examples. We're going to try to brainstorm together through an example on the topic of youth violence. And then that'll help to lay some foundations. And then on Wednesday, and the part 2 of this lecture topic, you'll get online the same way the other class is getting the whole thing online. And the interactive part you're going to need to do with yourself at home, but you can post stuff up to the discussion board for, this part's confusing, or I don't quite get it, all of that kind of stuff, or, oh, I get it, and here's how I would do this. And that, through this chapter, that's the point you need to be at the end, is might be murky in the beginning, you got to think about it a little bit, start trying to apply it, and then by the time we're done talking about this, this part should at least be, you get the big concepts, the pillars, and the details will fill in as we go through the next series of discussions about the logic of causation and all of that kind of stuff. So this is what we're going to do today. So again, I mentioned that some of the terms that are discussed in chapter 2 are going to be really important for this part of thinking about the research process as well. And so let's just talk about these terms and see what you guys already know. What's a variable? Anybody have a good definition for a variable?
The thing that the researcher manipulates.
Okay. I cannot spell manipulates right now. All right, somebody spell it for me. Come on. How do you spell manipulate? I don't even have the right letters to start out with. Oh yeah. Sometimes you just have to kickstart your brain. I think my brain is now on the tips of my fingers for typing, not on a pencil or something that can be manipulated. Okay. Does a variable have to be something that can be manipulated? There are other types of variables too. Okay. So what are some other properties of a variable? Yes?
Whether it's independent or dependent.
Okay, so that's getting to types. So hold that thought for a minute.
Is it something that can be measured?
Something that can be measured. Yes, that's accurate too. Part of the key that I'm trying to get at is right in the name, variable. What properties does it have? This thing that can be manipulated, can be measured, can be an independent, could be a dependent variable. What's special about it? I know, it's too obvious. It's in the name.
Varies.
Yes. It varies. Yay. So what does it mean that it varies?
Changes.
Okay, changes, good. Has multiple options or multiple values, not just one thing. Okay. What would be some examples of variables that we use in our work in Hdfs? What do you think? Yeah,
Gender.
okay, gender. And how does gender vary?
Other male.
What are the categories? Okay. Male, female. Other categories? Transgender.
Oh, I was just saying another variable. Would age be one?
Yep. Age, obviously, the lifespan. And you could measure age in years, months, days. I know when you have a little baby, you tend to measure their milestones in weeks, months. Yes? Race. And you know that all of these examples, we can think of what the categories would be, and typically there's more than one way to measure them. Some studies you'll see that they won't give people an option of another gender identification. Other studies they will. Good. So let's go on to a hypothesis. What is a hypothesis as it relates to social science and Hdfs? What is it that we're doing with the hypothesis? What is it doing for us? Yes?
Are you trying to test a variable? Or a set
Okay.
of like propositions to answer a question?
Okay. So can you put that in a definition of what a hypothesis would be? Because you're on the right track. Just
A set of variables being tested to answer a question or a theory.
okay. And when you say a set of variables, the hypothesis is typically trying to predict or make a guess about the relationships between these variables. And so you can think about a hypothesis as, you know, an educated guess that you're putting out to advance what you're going to actually do with those variables. So you can think about it that way. And so what do you think an independent variable is? Or what do you know an independent variable is? This came up on the quiz, and Ashley was talking about how sometimes it's confusing. You're trying to figure out what's the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. What do you guys know about an independent variable? Yes?
Not reliant on the other variable for change, for it to change.
Okay, so that's, your definition is kind of defining the dependent variable.
independent. It's
Right. So it's not relying on it, but it's reliant on something else. So in terms of what researchers are trying to do, when we propose that something's an independent variable, are we trying, well, let me just state it instead of posing it as a question. The dependent variable is typically this outcome or the end result of what we're interested in studying. So if we want to study the relationship between poverty and crime, which one are we likely proposing is the dependent variable? Well, I guess that's a bad example because poverty causes crime, crime causes poverty. It's kind of, they have a cross-directional relationship. How about education level and income? If I were to state a hypothesis that said individuals with higher levels of education will have higher income, which one is the dependent variable there? Income. So I'm saying that education is something that is causing the level of income. And so the outcome that I'm interested in is the income level. So you can think about the the independent variable as something that is related, potentially causally, but at least correlated, because it's very hard to prove that something is causally related to something else. So we can very easily find correlations between things. But if we logically think about the relationship between two variables and the things that come before it, or the things that are static characteristics like age and income are related to each other, right? And positively related. The older you are, the more likely your income is higher. So age would be an independent variable. I see the confused look on your faces, so I hope as we keep going through this that it'll get a little bit easier. But if you just can think about, in every hypothesis that someone's putting out there, they're typically stating some kind of prediction about how one variable is related to another, or a series of variables are related to a particular outcome. What you need to be able to do is to figure out, it's actually easier to identify the dependent variable than it is sometimes to identify the independent variable, but you really have to just pay attention to the way the statement is made in terms of trying to predict one part of, predict an outcome versus something that's probably a process or a correlate or those kinds of things. So another type of variable that we use a lot is what we call a control variable. And when we get into talking about experimental designs, we'll talk about this a whole lot more. But if you can just think about, besides an independent variable and a dependent variable, sometimes when we're testing hypotheses, we need to look at other things, like, if we want to test the relationship between education level and income level, we want to control for socioeconomic status at the beginning. So the things that would be control variables would be things that we want to hold constant so that we can know whether or not the relationship that we're observing between the independent and the dependent variable would hold true at all the different levels of socioeconomic status, for example. But we'll keep talking about this and going through it. But I wanted to kind of review these pieces a little bit. So what we get into in chapter 4 is this whole very I find that students find this part very tedious because it seems like researchers spend a ton of time on this, thinking about words, what words mean, how they're used, when they're used, what's the best way to talk about a concept. And sometimes I hear from students like they don't understand why we spend so much time on this. But this is our most important part of building a good research study, is making sure that we go through this process and pull out all the stops, that everything that we are interested in studying is well defined, it's logical, it's based on the best of what's out there and makes improvements on what's out there. And so these are some of the terms that you need to be thinking about. A lot of times we start this process with just some big ideas about what we're interested in and what might be relevant. And so you think about a concept as our mental image of what we think would summarize under, this larger notion. And so I'll just give you an example from something that happened in my other section when we broke into groups to talk about, to first get to know each other and talk about the research topics. There were 5 people who got into the group about aggression in early childhood. And I was, walking around like I do and talking with them. And 4 of the people in the group thought that that meant something particular, and 1 person in the group thought it meant something different. And to my surprise, the 4 people in the group thought of it more as victimization and child abuse and that kind of, and the other person thought of it as children being aggressive, which is what I meant by, the concept. And so in our everyday use of language, we can easily take the same exact set of words and use them in multiple different ways and not really know that, one group's going this way and another group's going that way. And what the research process definitely does is takes a look at all the different ways people have thought about a particular concept and states very specifically, okay, I'm using aggression in childhood and I'm thinking about it in this particular way. And making it very clear what the boundaries are. I'm not looking at this and I'm not looking at that, and so my study will focus on this part right here. And in that process, we have to look at, well, what did everybody else do who came before me? And so getting this right is incredibly, incredibly important. So you have to know what a concept is, and then this process that we go through of really specifying what we mean by a concept and what those boundaries are, that's called conceptualization. And conceptualization happens in a variety of different ways in research methods, depending on if you're doing inductive research or deductive research or purely descriptive research. And I'll talk about these 2 different ways that we use conceptualization. So remind me again, what's deductive research? What do we do in deductive research? Remember that circle, that research circle, and deductive. You start at the top, go down. Anybody remember? Yeah.
You start with like it's like more starting with like a broad idea, and then like going to like narrow, and
So you start with the theory, right? And that's the broad idea. And then you specify hypotheses. So the concepts that would be relevant if you're doing deductive research would come from those theories. So when you think about the relationship between theory and research, which we talked about a bit last week or the week before, this is how it comes into play. Those theories become kind of the pillars of what needs to get specified, and we're going to walk through an example of this in a few minutes. And then also the ways in which the concepts are defined fall within the parameters of how other people have used the concepts and those that were derived from those theories. So just hold that thought for a second. And then let's think about inductive research, where with inductive research, you're starting with what? What are you starting with inductive research?
Maybe more like a specific hypothesis.
Not inductive. In inductive, you're starting with the data or the observations that you're making. So instead of your concepts coming from the literature or from a particular theory, they're actually coming from sort of your direct observation of the world around you. And so, the example that we talked about a little bit before was the police officers observing that they're going to the same house over and over again was an inductive observation that they're making. And then from that made them wonder if we did something differently to intervene in those households where domestic violence was a problem, that maybe you could create change. So another example would be, let's say you're interested in figuring out how hand-to-hand drug sales happen. How do people who want to buy narcotics get their drugs? And so you start observing, and I did this little study as a project while I was a graduate student. I hung out in a park in New York City, and Popular Park, Washington Square Park in Manhattan, near NYU campus, and I could just sit there for a few hours at a time and watch different drug transactions happening. And there were all kinds of different people, like a lot of college students, a lot of people who looked like they were homeless, a lot of scary looking people who, I felt like, okay, I want to make sure I'm not anywhere near them. But for the most part, it was business people, it was just ordinary people walking through the park, and even the drug sellers didn't fit the stereotypes that I had conjured up in my mind. And the different ways that people would pass money or put money under a rock or pass drugs or put drugs under the rock, the way the police would react in this setting. All of these observations that I made on one day, spending like 5 hours or so at the park, became the basis for trying to categorize those things into bigger ideas. The concept I didn't have going in. I didn't have a concept of, what it looked like for, Mr. Joe Wall Street to be getting I guess I never saw anybody getting crack. I saw people getting powder cocaine. I saw people getting blunts. I saw people getting a lot of pills. And so, again, the conceptualizing process for inductive research would come kind of in the opposite kind of way of deductive. And so you can just think about this in terms of how would the concepts would emerge from what you're observing in the environment. And that process would kind of look different. And in the policing study that I'm going to show you, we included both inductive research and deductive research. I'm going to walk you through the deductive part, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the inductive part, because we learn different things from those two different methods. So some of what we could predict through theories and know ahead of time didn't fit exactly with what we could observe without putting all these boundaries on it. Because when you're starting with a hypothesis and you're trying to test that hypothesis, most of the ideas come from that pre-existing set of ideas. With inductive, the ideas come from what you're observing, and then you start building up some hypotheses. Any questions on that? So this is, I believe this exhibit, some version of it is in the textbook. They've changed it a few times over different editions. But just to get you to start thinking in terms of how researchers are going to think about what it is we're trying to do in the process of conceptualizing. We literally do go through this process of identifying what the concepts are going to be and thinking, reading the literature, seeing how other people have used those concepts, to thinking about what the actual variables would be, the things that we can measure, the things that actually vary. And the concepts, if you can imagine, they're sort of like bigger buckets that are holding ideas. And the variables are more specific about what those ideas represent. And the indicators are even more specific about what those variables represent and how we'd actually measure them. So let's walk through this example. Concept is income. The variable that we would actually measure could be annual earnings. And then an indicator, so the question we'd actually ask people on a survey or the census or whatever, what was your total income in 2010? So it's getting very specific. And what we're trying to do as we're moving across this process is make sure that when we get to an indicator, we've asked the question in such a way that it's going to mean the same thing to everyone who takes that survey or everyone who you interview and you ask that question. So it's got to be specific enough that, you know, it's not subject to interpretation and different people would answer it in different ways. So a good indicator would accomplish that. It wouldn't have these vague things. So income isn't super abstract, although you could think of other ways you could talk about income. But what about social class? Social class is more of a abstract concept, right? We don't go around wearing a label that, you know, my social class is X or Y. Although sometimes I feel like people assume that they can guess someone's social class based on what kind of clothes they wear, or what kind of car they drive, or what kind of whatever. Those are indicators in some ways of our social class. So what is social class? We try to break it down into variables. Unless we had more than one of these variables measured, we wouldn't necessarily have social class, right? A variable that would be part of measuring social class would be income. Another could be educational attainment and occupational prestige. And there might be others. So a lot of times what you'll see in a study is different ways researchers have tried to do a better job of measuring this concept of social class by having, you know, these key things measured in the best way. Can you think of anything else that might be an indicator of social class? might be a variable that could be part of it. So if you, well, I'll see if anybody has anything else that might be important to have in there. Does that cover it? If I asked you on a survey, and I'm not going to do this, but we can do it play for fun, to tell me what your social class is, would you know how to answer that? What would be some of the categories? How many people could answer that? What's your social class or your social economic status? Okay. And would it be based on your income right now as a college student? Or would it be based on your family? Okay. Your parents. And would it include all of these things or something else? Their income, their education level, their occupational prestige. Yeah. Okay. And I know when I was first studying sociology in college, and was when I realized that I grew up poor, and that I was actually from the lower class or the underclass because my family was on welfare, and I had no idea. I mean, I knew I was poor. I knew we didn't have a lot of money and that kind of thing, but I wasn't aware of social class. Like, I wasn't aware that there was this whole status hierarchy and that people had different opportunities depending on what social class they came from and all of that kind of stuff. So I remember when I was learning about this, it was just kind of light bulbs going off. And then thinking about other people that I grew up with in my little town and where they were in terms of social class. So in my little town, most people were either farmers, factory workers, few people were college educated, but most of those were like teachers, things like that. So I didn't see a lot of like variety in terms of like high status people or high income people. But it made me think about who were the high status people in my town. Well, one was the minister of my church, and she didn't make very much money at all. In fact, her income would probably actually put her right at the poverty line. But in terms of status, she had a very high status position. And so, in my mind, she was middle class or upper middle class or anything like that. When we think about a concept, an abstract concept like this, trying to understand why you would need all these variables to be able to measure this concept, part of it gets at that. So, if I did this for my family of origin, income level was 0, depending on the state. Educational level, both my parents dropped out of high school, so very low achieving. And occupational prestige, my mother worked in a factory and my father was disabled, injured on the job. So all of those things would have put us in the lower class. The thing that isn't in this list is sort of the values and the way that people come to think about their social class, which might be something that we would want to measure, right? And I think like in the modern era, when the census data come out and last week they announced that more and more families slipped from middle class status based on official definitions into lower status, they may or may not go through thinking about themselves in a different kind of way. So more people, according to the census, may be classified as living, you know, in lower middle class or lower class, but people wouldn't necessarily internalize that. Does that make sense? Okay, probably went too deep into that point, but I've been thinking about it a bit. All right, so we have these concepts, we're trying to figure out what they mean and how to be very clear about how we're using them in research. And then we go through this process of what we call operationalization, where we go from the abstract to very concrete to the point where, you know, we can show you specifically what we're trying to measure. And that's what you saw in that exhibit, moving from a concept to a variable and then to the indicators that we would measure. So the process of measurement, and these two, conceptualization and measurement, they absolutely go hand in hand, and you know, it is the most time-consuming part of developing a research study, is figuring out how you're going to first envision and conceptualize the question, and then how you're going to actually measure what you're trying to do in this study. So these two are hand in hand. And when we're doing research, we're not working in isolation of other scholars, of other information that comes before us. We're constantly trying to make sure we understand what is the best way to measure X, Y, and Z, and, you know, in terms of how the census data sets, you know, what income level is considered the poverty line and all of that kind of stuff. A lot of careful work goes into changing the numbers and figuring out, you know, all the different things that could matter in terms of that issue. And the same thing is true in almost everything else that we're trying to measure. And so you think about the psychometric properties of a variable. Have you guys heard that term? So a lot of times people will develop a scale or a set of questions that they ask people that will measure something, like attitudes towards authority, or attitudes toward police, or fear of crime. A lot of times we can't just ask one question. We need to ask a series of questions to get at different aspects or facets of that concept. And I'm going to show you this with the policing example in a minute. But when we do ask specific questions, we go through a whole series of statistical tests to make sure that the information that we're gathering back fits well together, has good, what we call psychometric properties. And so if we don't start out by specifying all of these kinds of detailed things about, you know, we want to know about job satisfaction, for example. And there are different ways that you can measure job satisfaction. And if we do measure it, if we, you know, use a scale that someone else developed in another study and, you know, maybe another decade, we want to make sure that our use of that scale is going to lead to valid and reliable results. So we go through a series of steps to make sure that those measures are going to do that. But again, if you think about this process, and we're going to go through this example in just a second here. All right. So, and I'll start passing these around. Survey instrument. Unless you're taking notes, there's no reason to have your computer on. it's tempting to do other things, but you can't pay attention and surf the web at the same time. Okay, so what do y'all know about community policing? You ever heard of it before? Yeah?
I don't know if this is right, but isn't it like when officers, do they like work with the community so that they kind of help the police on if they have a good relationship? They're more likely to get like tips and stuff versus if they have a bad relationship, they're gonna help the police.
Great, excellent. So community policing is a strategy where police officers work closely with community residents, typically to jointly define and solve problems in the community. And it's different from traditional policing, and part of the reason why this was something we're studying, and this study started in 1991 when community policing wasn't the buzzword, everybody wasn't using it, so this was kind of the beginning of the community policing movement. What happened under traditional policing and the way policing evolved, probably more than you want to know, but typically contemporary policing up until probably about the late 80s was operating under the philosophy that police needed to be separate from the community. That if they worked too closely with the community, they would be susceptible to corruption, and they would favor one group over another, and they wouldn't actually be professional in their role. And that was based on a series of assumptions and some high-profile cases where corruption was happening. Community policing was envisioned as a way to improve policing, and instead of thinking about the professional role as, this crime fighting, use intelligence, use information to solve crime, the community policing philosophy was really focused on the realization that over time, the more distant the police became from the community, the lower their clearance rates for crimes were. So if you want to increase clearance rates, you want to actually solve crimes, you need to actually have good relationships with the community. And how do you do that? Particularly when policing is a paramilitary organization. So what does that mean? That means that the training that police officers receive, the operations of what they do are very much in the putting a shield up around the institution so that there's separation between police officers and civilians. And so there's a lot of organizational reasons why it would be difficult to shift from traditional policing to something more community-oriented, because you have a whole workforce of people who've been trained and have been doing their job a certain kind of way, and then you're going to come in and try to change that. So that's what this study was trying to do. And part of the impetus for introducing community policing in the first place was two things. Well, many things, but the two that I'm going to highlight. City after city have a very difficult time recruiting individuals into the profession of policing. Why would that be? Why wouldn't we have people just knocking down the door to become a police officer?
It's dangerous.
It's dangerous. Okay. What else?
There could be like stigmas with being an officer.
A stigma attached to it. Have any of you ever looked at like the professions that have high suicide rates, high divorce rates, like if you look at the index of professions, police officers have among the highest divorce rates of any occupation, highest suicide, mental health. They're not the top on all of those, but they're very high in terms of those professions, or in terms of professions and job satisfaction. There's also a lot of burnout and people leaving the profession after a few years. So part of this reform was an effort to redefine what it is to be a modern police force and redefine what it means to be an officer. And the theory behind this would suggest that police officers who were working under the community policing philosophy would have higher job satisfaction, that they would actually enjoy their work. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of how that might work and why we thought it was important to study. And so a lot of times we don't actually think about police officers in terms of them having a quality of life. But if you see these other stats about the high divorce rates and the high suicide rates and heart disease, and I mean, they have a number of risk factors for a variety of things that are kind of closely related to the stress of the job. And so improving their quality of life and their job satisfaction could potentially make them better at what they're doing for all of us. So when I started this study, and I was working with my mentor who was PI on the study, Dennis Rosenbaum, and it was kind of exciting. It was my first grant proposal that I ever wrote as a master's student, and I was awarded $850,000 to do this 7-year study. And what we did in this study was actually look at police departments that were trying to implement this change compared to a police department that was not implementing this change, because obviously we wanted to be able to control as many things that were going on as possible. And so because there was a whole series of trainings that were going to happen that were, in many ways the intervention for the police officers, and then there was a whole series of realignments that were going to happen in terms of creating an operating unit that would be the community policing unit in both cities. There was a timing issue where we could get in there as the researchers, as the evaluators of these programs, and measure where the officers were at baseline. And so we did that. Baseline meaning before the intervention started. Like, what was it like? How were officers feeling about their jobs? Maybe they thought it was, the greatest job in the world. And we weren't going to change that in any way with an intervention. But so we did that. We went in there and we surveyed them, and you have a copy of the survey instrument that was not the pre-test, but one of the later years where we surveyed them. And then we also surveyed the officers in another police department that was just straight up doing traditional policing and nothing was changing. So, police officers in any city aren't living in a vacuum. They are exposed to shifts in the field, part of networks. I think now more so than before, because now we have the internet and people are sharing all kinds of information in new ways. But we were able to get in here and measure some of these things. So what were the things that we were measuring? I'm going to come back to unit of analysis in a little bit later. So I mentioned it was a pre-test and a post-test, and we actually came back and did, I think, 4 more post-test waves over a total period of time that was almost 7 years. But what we wanted to do was really look at these same individuals and track their changes over time with regard to the specific concepts that were really important. And so we could do that. We could look at what's going on with the individuals. And then we can also look at what's happening organizationally. And that was more of the qualitative part of the study, which I was also a part of. So, got the big picture. What we have to do first is really nail these concepts down. What are they? What's the best way to measure them? How do we know if we have community policing? What would we need to see? And so that's part of what we did in terms of operationalizing these concepts. So community policing, there's the on paper official definition that officers learned about in the training and maybe they could recite. And then there are specific things that if a police department is doing community policing, the way they operate should look differently than if they're doing traditional policing. And so our job was to measure that. Did anything really actually change? And then in terms of officers' quality of life, there's all kinds of things about being an employee in a organization that we would want to know about. There's also, these individuals are also people. They're not just police officers. So what are other things going on in their lives that may be impacted by their job? So quality of life, really trying to figure out what is that. And so here's my conceptual definition of community policing. And again, this is based on reading all the literature, thousands of studies about policing and dozens of books and going around the country talking to police chiefs and things like that. So community policing is a major organizational reform in which the line level officers are trained and assigned to work directly with citizens to solve problems in specific neighborhoods. Now, I'm defining it like this because I'm studying what happens throughout the organization and also studying what's happening with the individual. And if a police department, so this is one of the things that happened in the great pouring of money by the Clinton administration into community policing. Suddenly, so you guys are probably too young for this, but sometime around the time you were born, Clinton poured a ton of money. I don't know if you ever remember hearing about the 100,000 cops that were going to be put on the street during the Clinton administration. So they increased the size of many police departments if those police departments were willing to do community policing as a strategy. And so many cities around the country said they were doing community policing, but they actually did not change much about their organizational structure. Now, why is this important? Often the way a police department is run is based on officers assigned to responding to calls for service. Do you guys know what calls for service are? So you call 911, a dispatcher sends a police car to your house, that's a call for service. Typically the way policing works and under the traditional model is they're kind of like robots, interchangeable. Anybody, the dispatcher gets a call, sends the robot out to a particular house. 45 minutes later, that call's got to be cleared, and then they go to the next house, the next house, the next house. Typically, that type of work, if you're dispatched to do one thing after another, and you don't, so the robot goes, files a report, maybe arrests somebody, maybe not. Someone else comes along to actually investigate, do the deeper part of the police work. Take a homicide, for example. In a homicide, the officer that gets a call for service come, take a report. There's a whole bunch of other people that work in the police department that would actually do what they would consider the fun work of policing. The robot officer the one who responds to 911 calls, has to go on to the next call. They get disenfranchised from the work because they never see the connection between what they do in one part of the work to actually solving the problem. So under the community policing philosophy, it would be different. It's sort of working on, you know, what type of work alienates people from themselves, from feeling sense of accomplishment. And so under the theory was that, okay, if officers had more continuity from the beginning of a problem to the end, to solving it, that they would enjoy their jobs more. And in the process, they would build relationships with people in the community. They would be able to anticipate problems. So there's lots of reasons why it would be an improvement in theory. And in practice, we really needed to figure out what actually is changing. How do we know if there is an organizational reform? Because I mentioned the 100,000 cops. Typically, have any of you met like someone who is a community officer friendly? Like they have one person who is a community relations officer, or two people, or a small number of people, and their job is the one to get to know the community. So under this model, you go from having a bunch of specialists who do the different parts to having officers be more of a generalist, more of an expert in multiple areas, and also be able to see the connection between all these kinds of things. So you're learning more about community policing than you probably ever wanted to know. But these are the things that I had to figure out a way to measure, because they're all important indicators of community policing. So, you know, community policing is this very complex concept that if you don't specify how you're measuring it, and if you don't include all of these different aspects, you could conclude that, oh, you know, community policing doesn't do anything for officers' job satisfaction, or, you know, you could just make some erroneous conclusions. So these are some of the things that I had to include in that survey, and then I also had to have other ways to triangulate that information. So the survey was one source, but riding around with the cops and observing a ton of meetings where they were changing policies and procedures, looking through the policies and procedures, all of these different bits of information were then used to interpret what was happening in this situation. So some of the things that we actually measured: their knowledge of the philosophy of community policing. So if the training was effective, they should really be able to teach community policing. They should be able to talk the language and understand it. Changes in work assignment. So are they still the robot cop that goes from call to call to call to call, and that's how their days are laid out? And we kind of asked them to provide a diary of their days, and that helped us to understand how their job changed, because, you know, we asked them before the intervention and after, and then come back again. And particularly we were looking at, did their changes in assignment mean that they actually worked directly with citizens to solve problems? And so we wanted to see evidence of this. This is what the administration was saying they were doing. This is why they got this big federal grant to hire more police officers and to expand, was because they promised to change in these ways, and then we would see whether or not that helped. Were there new roles for officers? Did you see some of the breakdown in that, you know, division of how the work gets done? Were there new roles for supervisors? That's one of the parts of breaking down the traditional model of policing, was really that there would be these changes. Changes in management. And all of these things added together was really trying to get at, did anything really change for the line officer? Because that's what we wanted to see. And because we could measure all these different parts of it, of what community policing was, then we could figure out if, they were in fact, if community policing was being implemented, were any changes in the officer's job satisfaction or quality of life indicators, were any of those the result of the actual intervention? And so that's what we were able to do in the study. So we looked for these kinds of changes in what were the dependent variables. And just as community policing is this really complex concept, that's part of the reason why we would need to have multiple dependent variables and, to claim whether or not community policing reform improved job satisfaction or quality of life among officers, we really would need to measure all of these things and see how they changed. And the more things you measure, the stronger you can make your claim if you're finding support for particular changes. Okay. So thinking about what we're doing, what you guys are doing in your research projects of looking at youth violence, if we start with an original idea that violence is learned behavior, and we postulate that youth who engage in violence have learned the behavioral, cognitive, and psychological processes from others via observation, imitation, and modeling. Would this, if we were starting out in a research study like this, does that look deductive or inductive to you? Why do you think it would be inductive?
Because they probably observed youth and their behavior before coming up with this idea. Because they said youth who engage in violence.
Right.
It's from another area, so they obviously observed this.
Your intuition is right, exactly, but what I was, so I can see how you would go there real easily, because breaking this down, this is some very specific language from social learning theory, but I didn't put social learning theory in there specifically, but so I guess the youth may be going through a process that's inductive because they're observing others and they're either copying them or learning the techniques of getting involved in violent behavior. But if we start with a focus on a concept that we want to study violence as learned behavior, and then there'd be different theories out there that we might want to use. And we'd have to break this down to think about, well, what's the most important thing in this theory that we want to focus on. And what I would hone in on is the role of others. What does that mean? Are we talking about children learning from abusive parents? Are we talking about teens and preteens learning from other teens? Are we talking about all of the above? What is it? How would we break it down? And then what is violent behavior? And how would we break that down? So these would be some of the things that we would start out with in terms of thinking of this and thinking it through. So we have a number of different existing ways of measuring violent behavior that we could rely on. what would be one easy definition of violent behavior that we could use? It's already out there. Well, we could look at the Ohio Revised Code, Chapter 29, which is the criminal code for the state of Ohio. So we have laws that define, when behavior crosses a line to be legally considered violent. So that could be one place. Have any of you ever heard of the conflict tactics scale for studying domestic violence? Have any of you ever done a survey like in high school or something where they were trying to get at delinquency or, well, they probably weren't even trying to get at delinquency at that point. They were probably, drug abuse or some other antisocial behavior, and they'd ask you, have you ever kicked, bit, punched? Have you ever seen these kind of questions where they kind of go in as a continuum of different types of physical aggression from more minor to more serious? Have you ever stabbed someone? Have you ever had, used a gun? All of those kinds of things. So the way in which we break all of these things down is to look at existing ways of defining these things. Violent behavior. Some definitions of aggressive behavior and violent behavior would also include non-physical forms of aggression. When we're specifying violent behavior, we may want to say, okay, we're not interested in minor violence, we're only interested in things that would be considered a felony violent offense. Then we would definitely go to the the revised code for that. What about the concept of youth? What do we mean by youth? What do we want to specify some ages? Yeah.
Yeah, ages like, I don't know, 13 to 17.
Okay. When you guys think of your mental image of the concept of youth, does it include children or is it a little older? And yours sounds like it's a little older.
I guess you go with children or like adolescent, like teen.
Okay. But you don't think of young adults in the youth category?
I think 18 or older. I mean, if you're in high school, I guess you're still, people think you're young, but after I consider them adult.
Okay. What do you, from looking in the literature, what do you think most researchers would do? What do you think is pretty common to see this defined? I think the answer is there's a few different ways, and sometimes it's defined by developmental stages. Sometimes it's defined by how the data they have are collected. And so as we start going through this process and as you're thinking about, how this all works and, it probably seems somewhat strange that you would just take the words and start thinking about defining them in very specific ways. It makes a huge difference whether you're defining youth as, 5 to 24 or if you're defining it as 13 to 17. And it's not that one's right and one's wrong, it's just when you're trying to define a study, set out the parameters, you have to be very specific about what you're going to do, and you also have to look at how other people have defined these concepts. You can't just use them any way you want to in the literature, or you get together 3 or 4 of your friends and you all agree, okay, here's the definition we're going to use. No, you have to kind of see what's established, how other people use these concepts, what makes sense for the study that you're trying to do, and if you take a concept and use it in a new way, you have to justify why you're doing that. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just, it requires you to go through another series of steps to make sure that people understand what you're doing with that. So we're gonna continue thinking about this. I'm gonna finish going through this presentation and post it on either YouTube or just specifically up to Carmen. Probably just be a podcast. I don't want to be on video unless I have to. So again, no class on Wednesday. Your quiz is due the same way, same time, all that kind of stuff. And I'll see you next Monday. Sure.
Take the quiz with her.
Yeah, I will. And the one thing that's, yeah, we'll have to figure out something. She's going with me on this trip, so she's leaving tomorrow too. So she'll.
Coming back?
We'll be back Thursday night. So she'll probably be back in the office on Friday. So I don't know what your schedule is.
Well, I think I can take it on Friday. So I'll take like 3 of them. I think I missed 3.
Okay.
And the 4th one's due tomorrow, so I can do it online.
Yeah.
And when I take it, am I allowed to use like any notes or?
Yeah, it's open book, it's
It's
open
open book,
whatever, so you just
open
have, it's
everything.
timed, you have 25 minutes.
For per quiz, right?
Yeah.
25 minutes per quiz. Oh, okay. It's not like long, right?
No, it's 10 questions. It's
Oh,
easy.
okay.
It's really just meant to be, checking to see if you're reading and, are you able to apply the concepts?
Because I haven't bought the textbook yet, but
Okay.
do you think I'll be okay by using the
No, you
PowerPoint?
need to,
So, okay,
you need
I'll
to,
send
yeah.
both of them.
Because a lot of times I either don't get to something or, like I know in the one chapter, I didn't really get into like something that was covered in 4 questions in the quiz.
Oh.
But people still did fine because they read, so it's just
Okay.
covered in the book.
And Ursula, are we like I think I saw in the syllabus about the group presentation and
Mhm.
stuff. Will you be putting me in one of those groups or?
Yeah, we haven't completely formulated all the groups yet.
Okay.
So we've kind of met a couple times, but it hasn't, it was just sort of to see what people are interested in. And once we get through the midterm, then we'll start being in groups a whole lot more. So for now, it's not really
So
set,
will you be
but you can
choosing
decide
or-
which, of those 7 topics, if you let me know your first choice and your second choice.
Topics on if I saw it. Oh, was it in the syllabus?
Yeah, it is.
Oh,
It is.
okay.
So it's all within the bigger topic of youth violence, and then there's like bullying and relational aggression, there's aggression in early childhood, there's school violence, exposure to violence and victimization, so they're all somewhat related, and what else? Violence prevention, evidence-based violence prevention, dating violence.
You're gonna group us by the interest of the
Yeah,
topics.
yeah, yeah. And then you'll do a research project together.
Okay. Can I turn in the first assignment by email this week?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
You want me to, do I post it on the Carmen? Because I posted the second assignment on the Carmen.
Yeah, on Dropbox. Yeah, that's,
Yeah, Dropbox. So I can do the first one. in
Yeah, that's
Dropbox,
fine.
or you want me to-
That's
do I
fine.
have to
And-
bring copy to the hard copy?
no, you don't. Post it, and then if you want to just send Ashley an email to let her know that it's there, so she'll go look
Okay.
for it to grade it.
Oh, okay, so do you want me to, email Ashley for the second one?
No, I'm gonna take care of the grading of the second one, so
Oh, okay.
she's just doing the first
Oh,
one.
okay.
I took
Thank
the
you.
easy one.
Okay, thank you.